Here we go. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, I said last week that David was probably more right than even I knew about how Quaker I was. I will confess that the former Southern Baptist United Methodist in me still wonders, how long do we sit quietly? Am I supposed to do something now?
It's a learned skill.
Take a yoga class.
Yeah, I've tried that a time or two. Yeah. It is an interesting thing. I've shared with you my practice of a 12-step program, and there's actually a portion of that in one of the steps where it says that we sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. So there's a meditation piece to it, and so we share that.
I keep telling you.
Yes, and I have heeded that as well as you have heeded the many things I have kept to telling you, but we won't get into that. Last week, some of you will remember, some of you I say because some of you weren't here, and some of you because some of you are like me and just don't remember, that I took a somewhat unconventional approach to tying scripture and message. Say unconventional, at least unconventional for me. I typically will select a passage or a selection of passages and wrap the message around the core of those passages. And what I did last week was take a step back and use the entire book of Job as the context or as the scripture reference for the passage. That was fun. So I kind of like to do that again this week, not with the book of Job, but and not with an entire book of the Bible, but with a large selection of scripture, and focus on Genesis chapters 1 through 12. A lot there. I believe that stepping back and looking at large portions of scripture, or looking at the scriptures as they are assembled and configured before us, is helpful for a number of reasons. One in particular is that it gives us a chance to say, why does this passage or these collection of passages, does this book or does this selection of books exist? Why were they written? Was there something about the way they were written or the way they were assembled that in itself contains a message that is as important as the interpretation of a particular verse? And I think it is. If nothing else, it gives us insight into the intent, well, perhaps the unintentional consequences of the work of the Spirit with the people who did the work of writing and assembling what we have bound together in leather and somewhat elevated to a somewhat holy position in our in Christendom these days. So let me begin by reading a few verses out of the first chapter of Genesis. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Genesis as the beginning of the Old Testament, as Christians refer to it, or the Torah as the Hebrews or the Jews refer to it, has the specific purpose of setting the stage for the biblical story. It sets the stage for the biblical drama of sorts. In the beginning, there was God, Yahweh. There is nothing, just God. Actually, it's not even fair to say there's nothing, because even the nothing is not something, really. The best we can describe it is that it's in the beginning there was God, and there was a non-thing, a formless, lightless darkness, a void, the absence of things. And then yet God's wind blew upon it over the face of those waters. The stories of the creation, and I say stories plural because there are actually multiple stories about creation that are woven together as if they were one. But the stories about creation that are contained in these early verses of Genesis set the stage for God and the good creation, for God's power, God's force, God's spirit, God's light calls into being something. And one by one, those somethings are labeled as good and good and good. And then God creates humankind. And with the crowning achievement of that creation and everything in place, God calls it all very good. We might think of that moment, that brief moment in the drama of the unfolding of God's work with the world, is that moment as the moment in which it's all perfect. If we understand the word perfect as not, as it I think is intended to be understood biblically, in that everything is whole, balanced, and complete. Perfection is not without blemish or not including everything, but it is the wholeness, the fullness of what is needed and what is meant to be. And the stage is set, and God's goodness is present in all creation, and the creation itself is deemed good. And then in Genesis, we have stories of a series of events. What's the first thing that happens after everything is good?
Something bad happens.
Right. So we have Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and they are told, do not, everything is for you, but don't eat of this one particular fruit, the knowledge of good and evil, because if you do, what are we told?
You'll die.
You'll die. What do? They commit a sin, a disobedient act against God's will. And then what happens?
Nobody punished the snake.
Nobody punished the snake. Yeah, well, it may interest you to know that the snake's not the focus of the story.
Yes. They get tossed out.
They get tossed out, right? So they're punished. There's judgment against the sinfulness of humanity. But they don't die. Instead, they live. So there's this little flicker of grace that happens. Sin, judgment, but God's grace. And then humanity does what humanity does and grows and multiplies. And what's the next biblical event that we hear happening? Who can name the next one? Pardon?
The murder?
Yes, Genesis 4, 1 through
Murder is
16,
biblical.
Cain and Abel. What's the sin? Murder. How's it? Does Cain kill Abel or Abel kill Cain? It's Cain. Cain kills Abel, right?
Right.
Abel doesn't kill Cain, even though he was Abel. Cain wasn't Abel, so he.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway.
Who's on first?
Right. Exactly. So the sin is the commission of murder. What is the judgment that's placed upon Cain?
He's tossed out too.
He's cast out as well. And for all intents and purposes, he's as good as dead at that moment. And he even says so to God. But then what happens?
He's given them protection.
Yes, if you listen to David, God gave him a dog, but I'm not real sure about that. But there's a mark.
It's a Jewish midrash.
Yeah. There's a mark that's given Cain to prevent him from dying. Judgment, sin, judgment, and grace. Seeing a pattern here? All right. What's the next event? We've got the weaving. The world gets populated. It's miraculous how fast we go from 2 to about 4 to a few thousand. But then what happens? Noah, right. So what happens? What's the sin there? We're looking for the pattern. What's the sin?
General lawlessness.
It's overall wickedness of humanity. So what was wrong with Adam and Eve and what was wrong with Cain and Abel is now wrong rampantly in the world. God's judgment is, let's just flood it all and be done with it. Except there's Noah and some animals, probably a couple of snakes that get saved. And then as the floodwaters recede, what's the symbol of grace or the mark of grace in that story? The doves and the rainbow. The rainbow. Let this forever be the symbol. I'll never do this again. I'll never destroy the world again. Humanity will never be destroyed this way again. So we have sin, we have judgment, but we have grace. What's the next story?
Tower.
The Tower of Babel. In Genesis 10, 1 through 11, 9, we have the story of Babel. In fact, let me just turn to a couple of passages. So tell me, what happens here? What happens?
Everybody there were the languages that people couldn't communicate, couldn't speak because the languages were on the line.
That's the judgment.
That was the punishment.
Right? So
Yeah.
the sin was
Trying to build a tower.
trying to build a tower to heaven. What and is that it might be idolatry, self-worship. We are as good as God. We can do this. So the elevation of humanity to an inappropriate place. The judgment is the confusing of the language and the scattering of the people. So we have sin. We have judgment. But there's no grace. All seems to be lost. What follows in Scripture after that is a bunch of names and descendants and who begat who and who married who and who begat that. And we really don't have any sort of blessing at the following of the scattering of the people. Until God comes to Abram and says, "Psst, come here. Let me tell you what I'm going to do with you." And at that moment, what we have contained in Scriptures is the core of how God moves forward with grace in the world. The stage has been set. When humanity sins, there is judgment, and God responds with grace. But at this point, the grace, the focal point of that grace, is none less than Abraham and Abraham's children, the nation of Israel. And thus the drama unfolds. So by looking at this particular assembly of stories and the drama contained therein, we can see that it was the intent, deliberate or accidental, of the Torah to tell us that God is at work in the nation of Israel, working about a plan to redeem the world. What we have in Genesis 1 through 12 is a dramatic telling of the story of God's work in the world that says that there is an apparent but unreal power of sin in the world. And there is an unapparent but real power of God's grace in the world. Let me say that again. There is an apparent but unreal power of sin in the world, and an unapparent but real power of grace in the world. And when I take that truth and lift it out of Scripture and look through it as a lens on the life that we live today, I have to ask the question, where's the apparent but unreal power of sin? That is easy question to answer. Our media, social media, and mainstream media, and anywhere you turn, does a great job of broadcasting the apparent power of sin in the world. We hear the stories about the thousands of children who are starving and lack parental love and have been taken, who live motherless and fatherless. We hear those stories. And well, we do to respond to them. But we don't hear the stories of the billions of children that are born, that are comforted and suckled by their mothers and raised by their parents and have the love of a family. Nor, well, we hear the stories of the evils that people do, the apparent and visible sins of everything from murder to assault, drug addiction, robbery, thievery. But what we don't hear about is the inner stories of those individuals and the transformations that so often take place quietly and permanently to make their lives different. And so I simply say this. Inasmuch as God reached into the world with a whisper and beckoned Abraham forward to create a graceful moment for all of humanity, we can take great comfort in knowing that that same God leans into our world and beckons us to move forward, to change, and to grow, and to be more like God. We sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of God's will for us and the power to carry that out.